So now it's my pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Andrew Blum, a journalist and author of the book, Tubes, A Journey to the Center of the Internet, the first book-length look behind the scenes of our digital lives at the physical heart of the Internet itself. Before falling into the Internet's depths, Blum was writing about architecture, design technology, urbanism, art, travel, all subjects arising out of his relationship between place and technology. Since 1999, his articles have appeared in Wired magazine, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Business Week, Metropolis, Popular Science, Gizmodo, for you techies, The Atlantic, Architectural Record, and Slate, among many other places. He has degrees in literature from Amherst College and in human geography from the University of Toronto. He lives in his native New York City with his wife, his daughter, and his son. And please join me in welcoming Andrew Blum.
Good morning. Let me just make sure my slides are here. Oops. It's exciting to be here. When I started thinking about what it might mean to visit the internet about 3 or 4 years ago now, everybody said that there was this mythic place where all of the most important people in telecom gather in shorts and aloha shirts. And that if I wanted to meet the people who ran the internet, this was the place to come. And I didn't make it then. It's only now that I made it, with many thanks to Joe Wyman and Stefan Beckert and others who saw and hoped that I would have something to share with you guys. When the reality is that most of the time what I'm talking about is explaining to people how the internet works, which I'm going to assume is something most of you know. What I'm going to do instead is share a little bit about how I framed what the internet is physically for a lay audience, for an audience of consumers of all kinds, whether a CTO at an enterprise or whether your wife or mother who is deciding which ISP to buy, and then share a bit about where I think that those sort of demands are going, where I think people are gonna ask of their network connection going forward in the future. For me, it's all about this question of how can I touch it physically, and when I started, that was something that seemed almost impossible. This was the image of the internet. If you do a sort of Google image search of the internet, this is all that comes up, or at least until recently, which I'll tell you about. It seemed to be this amorphous blob. It seemed to be something that had no physical reality of its own. You couldn't find yourself on it. It always reminded me a bit of the Apollo image of the blue marble of the Earth, and I think it was similarly meant to make us feel sort of small in the face of this huge expanse. And it was amazing to me, though. I mean, I was ostensibly writing about architecture, about infrastructure, about physical things, but I was spending all of my days sitting at my desk in front of a screen, and the thing that I was connected to didn't exist. It was this fluid, amorphous nothing. There was nothing out there, and you couldn't really go to look for it. There hadn't been anything written essentially since, at least in the lay press, since the telecom boom of a decade ago. When I first mentioned to my editor at Wired that I wanted to write a story about the wires, he said, "Oh my God, we forgot about the wires," and that was the kind of tone, at least among my journalist colleagues, writing primarily about "quote unquote" the internet. And then what changed things for me most dramatically was when this happened one day, when the internet broke and the cable guy came to fix it, and he followed the wire from this dusty clump behind my couch out to the back of my building and then saw a squirrel running along a cable. And he said, "I think that's your problem. I think a squirrel is chewing on your internet." And this, of course, seemed preposterous because the internet, as I understood it, was a transcendent idea. It was a set of protocols that had changed the world, had changed dating and revolutions and stock trading and everything you can possibly imagine. It was decidedly not something that squirrels chew on, and yet that in fact was the case. A squirrel had in fact chewed on my internet. And I got this very clear image in my head of what would happen if I yanked the cable from the wall. Essentially, where would it go? Where would it lead? What would I find there? Who would I find there? All of you. And that's what I did. I started to sort of poke around and ask questions and say, okay, what is this? What is out there? And I quickly felt like a fool, because only fools think the internet actually exists. This is the episode of South Park where the internet breaks, but there's no internet to know if the internet's broken. So they become internet refugees in California because they hear that's where the internet is, and they do everything they can to sort of get the internet working, and they sort of shoot at it, and they play the Close Encounters of the Third Kind song at it to try to wake it up, but that doesn't work. And instead, they go around the back and they unplug it and they plug it back in, and finally the flashing yellow light is steady green. But this embarrassed me, that this was the sort of conventional wisdom about what the internet was, that it wasn't something you could actually go and touch. It was this, again, it was this transcendent idea, not a physical thing. If it wasn't a big thing like that, it was a little thing like this box on the British sitcom, The IT Crowd, where they convinced their colleagues that they've convinced the elders of the internet to lend her the internet, this box, for the afternoon. Normally it lives on the top of Big Ben, of course, because that's where you get the best reception. But instead, she can take it and she can present it and she can say, this is the internet. And she looks at it and she says, this is the internet, the whole internet. Is it heavy? Which is, of course, the question we always ask about the cloud. The cloud is meant to not exist. The term of the cloud suggests that there's nothing out there, that it's weightless. And so for me, it was all a matter of trying to sort of push against this conventional wisdom of the internet not being actually something you can touch. And the only person who seemed to have a clue, the person who seemed to have a sense of what the internet actually was, at least before I met all of you, was Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, who famously said in 2006 that the internet is not a big truck, it's a series of tubes. And this, again, was hilarious, right? This became the sort of ultimate meme about what the internet actually is. We all sort of laughed at him because he was stuck in this old way of seeing the world. He hadn't realized that we had moved on to this weightless world of protocols and clouds and transcendent ideas about communication, not stuck in the old world of pipes that connect one place to another, or more accurately, tubes. But in fact, this became the sort of key way for me to frame it, to think about what is it physically. Speaking in technical terms, I would often tell network engineers that I was interested in layer 0 to layer 2.5. And in fact, that was sort of a big part of what I was trying to do. I was trying to say, if the logical, the sort of world of algorithms and protocols and this other was inscrutable to me and inscrutable to so many of us, there was another world that could be focused on, which is the physical, meaning what the machines are, what the internet is actually made of, and the geographic, where it is. And that brought me to a place like this. This is a fiber optic regeneration hut in Kansas. And actually this photograph was taken for a photo essay for Wired. That was the sort of first entree for me into the topic. And it came out of a conversation with a marketing person at the time, Global Crossing, saying, so is there like a hut in the middle of the country that regenerates the signal? She said yes. And then we got on the phone a guy with a pickup truck in Kansas City responsible for maintaining all the fiber optic regeneration huts in a 500-mile radius, and proceeded to have this very surreal conversation about which of those fiber optic huts was the most beautiful. And it turns out that this is the one. But it was amazing to me to begin to recognize that it followed the old paths, that it wasn't this totally virtual thing, but in fact had a lot of weight and was really about these very physical places. And that also meant that I had to sort of both reduce my time scale. I had to say that just because a signal passes through this place, it's sort of an infinitesimal fraction of a second, doesn't mean that it's actually there. Doesn't mean that this isn't a legitimate place of the internet. And so once I sort of understood that and realized that this could be framed as both a physical, what it's made of, and geographic, where it is, I started to think about sort of what those other pieces were. And I ended up thinking about the internet essentially as in 3 different categories. I thought of it as the internet exchange points, the places where networks meet. This being 60 Hudson in New York, of course, one of what I started to call about a dozen of the buildings in the world where more networks meet than any place else. And when you tell an audience of people who have never heard this before, they think that's remarkable. It doesn't register that one network has to physically connect to another. And it's even more surprising that that happens in such a short list of places, in Ashburn, in New York and Ashburn, in Telehouse in London, at DKIX, at AMP6, or at One Wilshire in Los Angeles. And so that became one category, in some ways the most important category of places, these internet exchange points. The second category, of course, are the lines in between, the kind of undersea cables, which I always describe as the kind of most poetic pieces of the internet. This also came from that Wired photo essay. This is Hibernia Atlantic's manhole near Halifax, which came out of a conversation that when something like, when a cable lands on the shore, is there a manhole? Yes, okay, which is the most beautiful manhole? And it turned out to be this one, a great spot near Halifax. In the third category, and in some ways the one that required the kind of most subtlety of saying this is and this isn't of what I'm talking about in terms of a data center, was saying that a data center is a place where data is processed and stored, and drawing a somewhat fuzzy line between places focused on connectivity, like 60 Hudson or like Ashburn or like Telehouse, and places focused on storage and processing. This being Facebook's data center in Prineville, Oregon, which I also recognized and which I think people began to really appreciate as a place that sort of monumentalizes the physical infrastructure of the internet. A lot of, I approached this as an architecture writer originally, and a lot of architecture writers said, well, which of these buildings have architecture with a kind of capital A? And it's a short list. It's a short list of places that decide to say with their building, to sort of express their ideals with their building. But I think that's changing. I usually say this, as well as Telehouse's new building in London that has the pixels on the outside, as buildings that sort of express ideals through their facades and through what goes on inside. So if there's a way of then helping people understand what the internet is by thinking about it in physical terms, what happens next is quite surprising, because people start asking a lot of questions. They say, okay, what about security? What's going on here? Why haven't we heard about this before? What's keeping us from that? And one of the things that was most striking to me was that really the internet has now become, but for all of us, the most dominant means of communication. Often the only pipe into our house, the only thing that has to work if we're going to keep our ties with everybody else. And yet, the way in which it's entirely opaque. It's often very difficult to sort of see, beneath the veneer of the brand name or the little service bar on the top of our cell phone and understand what's going on. And that's quite striking compared to so much else in our lives. When I started to think about this, I realized that from the perspective of metrics, from the sort of ability we have to understand the world around us through our devices, there's a sort of endless number of ways that we can do that. Whether it's the altitude of my flight. This is information that is sort of now commonly communicated, but it's instantaneous. The exact location. How many minutes the subway is coming. When the thunderstorm is starting. And yet, with the internet, when you get to that metric of a speed test, it's this sort of blunt instrument. You can't really have a sense about what that means. People don't know how to read that. Trace routes are somewhat, trace routes are kind of an expert level tool. And yet, my sense is, people want to know more. Why can't we know more? Most of us access the internet from sort of fixed places, from home or the office. Most of us spend the majority of our time on a short list of sites. And yet, the connections between those sites, whether it's the peering links or whether it's the traffic congestion on those links, are unspoken. I see some of the chatter on the on the Nanog mailing list. I hear about it in different ways through network engineers, and yet for consumers, it's not there. There isn't a way to sort of check the status of your flight for the internet. That might sound completely bizarre and heretical, but when you're watching a Netflix movie at home and it doesn't work, you want to know what's going on. You want to know just as the bus is going to be late. And I think that's the kind of direction we're going in, towards more metrics that allow us to see deeper into the network and understand what's going on behind the scenes. And I heard that from people in their questions. How can I look this up? How can I know this? And there aren't really tools that people want. And I don't just mean that for people at home, but I mean that for an enterprise level customer who might be provisioning services for a law firm of 5,000 people. I think the direction is towards more of this kind of measurement. The sort of second category of things is more political. This is not about infrastructure, but when this, and it turned out to not be entirely true, but there was this recent hubbub when Instagram announced that they were now potentially selling your photos. this sort of chattering classes erupted and said, what are you talking about? These are our photos. You can't do that. And there was this quite believable sort of story that went around that they lost 25% of their users in a day. And the reason it was believable is because it seemed as if, we are entrusting so much to the cloud. We are so dependent on these services. And yet the terms of service, technically speaking, are, again, incredibly opaque. They're very difficult to understand. Nobody reads them. And yet, I think there's a kind of almost Whole Foods effect that's going to happen. I think that people are, as we become increasingly dependent on these services, they're going to care more about the sort of politics and provenance of where these services are coming from. That there's a sense that these things matter in a way that they might not have before when the phone was the phone company. And I think that's a way that there's a sort of opportunity there as well to kind of open up a bit more and say, this is what we're made of. This is our metal as a company. And again, it cuts across many different customer bases. You might see it now sort of in a business-to-business sense, but I think it will begin to bubble up. When you look at the statistics about how many people hate their cable companies in the US, you recognize that there's a huge opportunity for these companies to be friendlier. There's a huge opportunity for us to know more about where our internet comes from, which comes out of recognizing the sort of basic idea that the internet has parts and pieces, that it's not this amorphous blob. And finally, the third thing, if the first is metrics and the third is sort of politics, the second is politics, the third thing that I think is going to change is more transparency. When I started to think about visiting the internet, this was the Google Maps view of Google's data center at the Dalles. It's about 2009. The picture is not, it's not an old picture. It's obscured. It's sort of a bad Photoshop job of rubbing out their own data center. Over time, that has changed. It now looks more like this, and it's sort of politely labeled. But one of the things that was striking to me is that this is, Google's data centers are the place that are, for many people, this is where the internet is. This is where most of their stuff is. This is their main access point. And yet, for example, when I visited there, I got no sense, at least from Google, that was a relevant question. It was particularly striking because I visited this place at sort of the end of my journey after visiting dozens of other data centers where network engineers had unfailingly said, yes, we understand that people want to know more about this. We're happy to tell you about it. At Google, I was treated to a bit of a tour of the parking lot, and then was served this lunch and told how much everybody likes working at Google. And it was quite striking to me because it was as if the company that knows the most about us was the one that was least willing to engage with our own interest, with the sense that we want to know something about them. We want to know where our internet comes from and what its parts and pieces are. Of course, that changed this fall quite gratifyingly. Google sort of opened up. There had never been an image of a Google data center, and suddenly it was big news when Google announced, and I think in around October, with a big story in Wired, and the sort of sense this is where your stuff lives, and these beautiful photographs. And what's so striking to me is that this immediately replaced the amorphous blob as the iconic image of the internet. No longer was it something that was just this thing that was more about ideas than about physical things. Suddenly Google said, this is where we are, this is what it is. And Google being Google, that had a very powerful effect. And I think it's that kind of transparency that's going to begin to become more important. You kind of, you have to sort of open up your slaughterhouses. You kind of have to, share a bit about what's happening there. And I've seen that trend as I've been making inquiries and trying to visit places of the internet over the last few years. More and more people have sort of abandoned this kind of Fight Club attitude of, the first rule of data centers is don't talk about data centers, and instead have said, yes, this is an important part of our business. The security concerns are surmountable. We're happy to show this off. And for that to come from Google was a major shift. And then, of course, when you see a picture like this, also from Google, it's quite clear what it looks like, that this is tubes. You sort of recognize that this is, in fact, an incredibly physical thing. And so it's been surprising for me to the degree to which people are curious about this, the degree to which they want to know where their internet comes from. Globally, the book is now going to be translated into 9 languages, including Chinese, Japanese, and Russian. And so that sort of trend towards transparency and knowing what these parts and pieces are, I think becomes an opportunity for all of you. Because my hunch is that the spotlight is going to continue to grow. And you can put it in positive terms, you can put it in negative terms, but it's sort of hard time to kind of get your house in order in terms of that. So I think that might sound a little strange to many of you, but I hope that resonates. It's been a fascinating journey for me to visit all these places. And one of the most important things for me is how welcoming so many of you were in sort of opening up the pieces that you shared. So thank you.